Domestic violence isn't something that just stays at home. It's something that can come to the workplace quietly and often dangerously. This is something leaders need to understand in order to create safer workplaces. Team, domestic violence is one of these topics we see day in and day out because we do these assessments, we build these programs, we build training programs around this topic. It's a required topic within your program and your training. But what's one of the biggest misconceptions that you see when we're dealing with leaders and having to introduce this topic to their program?
It's always, man, when we start building out policies and stuff like that, because it is a requirement, we put it into the policy, obviously, because it needs to be addressed. And almost every time throughout an organization, that is one thing that gets focused on by the organization, by their HR, by their legal team. It seems often that organizations want to avoid it altogether.
Right.
Yeah. They just want to pretend like, oh, it's a personal subject. We don't want to talk about it. We don't want to have to talk to our employees about it. We're just going to pretend like it doesn't happen. And we know, like, obviously being in the industry, like how much of that workplace violence stems from intimate partner violence, domestic violence. It always ends up, not always, it often ends up on the doorstep of the workplace. So it needs to be something that is addressed.
Jake, there's a big relationship between workplace violence and domestic violence. Mm-hmm. And I don't think people really understand that connection. Can you speak about that for a minute?
Yeah, they're definitely one and the same. Kind of how you were saying in the beginning, Stace. They are often, domestic violence, intimate partner violence is often seen as a thing that happens in the home and not recognizing the spillover effects that it can have in the workplace. Because oftentimes, and these are some of the worst effects, is it's those things that are beneath the surface of the water where you have somebody experiencing abuse and they're embarrassed. They don't want to say anything. They maybe feel shame, fear, whatever that feeling is that they have. And so they don't necessarily feel comfortable bringing that forward on the one side of this. And then the workplace is entirely ill-equipped to observe for what those warning signs might be and address those in an empathic manner. Because what happens is, you might have this abuse going on when early on there might be some support we can get these individuals, the survivors, and do something about it. But when this perpetuates, what happens is eventually, the survivor will try to leave the relationship. Well, how does this come into the workplace then? Well, they leave the relationship. They don't know where they live anymore. They don't know where they're staying, but they know where they work. And so you see abusers time and time again come into the workplace, or stalking, cases. But sometimes there's even those behaviors that you see that you don't even necessarily equate it to domestic violence or somebody experiencing domestic violence, because it's not something that's out of the norm. Remember that grocery store chain we were working with, where they, had an individual who was experiencing abuse, and she would come into the store, and one day she came in wearing flip-flops, which that's a very well understood thing in that environment because of the safety concerns and everything else. So the supervisor started unpacking that with the person, and the individual was so distressed by the relationship they were in, didn't even recognize that they had put flip-flops on. So it's just those different things that, we can put these different signs together and start, hopefully getting in front of it, because it is a misnomer, but it is an absolute fact that it is part of workplace violence and does impact the workplace.
Yeah, and one thing that I see is, as we're building out these policies and we're like, hey, it's a requirement that, it's addressed within this policy, and people are like, oh, I don't want to touch it. Domestic violence, I don't really want to, go down that road or whatever it is. But really, these policies shouldn't just be punitive. Mm-hmm. What we encourage, at the center is to have a lot of resources in these policies for individuals going through that. So they can look at it and say, oh, if I come forward and talk to my supervisor, talk to security, HR about this topic that I'm going through, maybe there are resources within the organization and things that the organization can do to protect me, but not just protect me, protect the entire organization. Because when it comes there, it becomes all of our problem.
Yeah.
And so when we see in training, we hear all of these, different circumstances, and, we tend to think this is a woman's issue. Have you guys seen certain cases where, it's not just a woman's issue, it's actually happening to men as well, or same-sex relationships, not just, traditional relationships?
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. I've heard a couple cases, and specifically too, and it seems as though there's a tendency for people to feel ashamed, like they want to hide that stuff, which makes it even more difficult. The couple particular cases where the man was a victim that I've heard of recently is it was very hard to spot because they wanted to hide everything that was going on. They didn't want to say anything, which makes it extremely difficult for, peers and coworkers, organizations to actually identify what was going on, because the men in those particular cases didn't want to say anything. They didn't mention anything. It was other things that started showing up, like they started showing up to work late. One in particular started showing up to work late, didn't really have any good reason, justification for it. But some of those things, built up over time to where there was able to intervene with it. But he just hid everything that was going on. Didn't want to say anything to anybody. Didn't want to bring his personal business to work because, he thought there'd be some sort of repercussions if he were to bring that up, and really just hid it from the organization for a long time. And it wasn't until a coworker that happened to know the situation going on and the outside kind of like, hey, it's actually confronted him, talked to him. It's like, hey, some of your stuff, I know you're going through a lot, and some of it's coming to the workplace too. It's bleeding over. I can see it in your job performance. I know you're showing up late to work all the time, and I happen to know why. So maybe we need to loop the leadership involved. But it's an extremely good point, I think, to make, is that people hide this stuff, and it's extremely difficult for organizations to see.
There's the feeling that there's work and there's personal life.
Right.
And never the twain shall meet, where that really couldn't be further from the truth. I mean, it just is, especially nowadays with the virtual working environment, or, people working from home.
Oh yeah, that's a whole nother topic right there.
Even talking about this subject too, like along with this often comes, protective orders, restraining orders, and stuff like that. Have you worked with organizations? Like how difficult is that conversation to have with lawyers and organizations almost daily?
Yeah. I mean, it's just it all comes back to, we're trying to provide, as part of our commitment to a safe and secure work environment. And while some organizations don't want to make people come forward if they've gotten a protective order or restraining order, but they do have the ability as a policy to make it that strong. And it's a good thing to do, because it's not a punitive thing like you were talking about. The reason, if somebody doesn't come forward and you have it mandated, it's not that you then discipline them. Maybe it's just an educational issue, because the end state of this kind of program is we're trying to create a safe work environment. So if they can bring that information forward, then we can put in place protective measures, not only for that individual that is receiving that, but also the ones that are in the work environment collectively. So it's allowing the workplace to have a holistic plan to get in front of this issue.
Yeah, and it's just another way that we can support this culture. But actually, speaking of culture, when we travel all over the world and deliver this type of training, I noticed that there are cultural considerations that come into play here, where I actually had a supervisor, a pretty high-level supervisor, tell me in one of the trainings that as I'm delivering this, I could see he's kind of uncomfortable talking about domestic violence. And he's like, I just don't understand how this is a workplace issue. That's somebody's personal life. And he's like, in fact, I had this employee and she was coming to work, and I noticed her husband kept visiting her at work all the time, and she didn't look happy to see him. And sometimes, there'd be a little bit of a conflict or tension. And he actually got mad at her and said, don't bring this to the workplace. This is inappropriate for you to do that. And so she went to great lengths to try to hide it and all, but when, your spouse shows up at work, there's only so much you can do. And I just kind of stepped back, and all the other supervisors in the room were like, what? you did what? What happened? Like, no, that's not okay. And he had a hard time understanding that. And how that was an okay topic to even discuss in the workplace. And so there's a lot of cultural, considerations when we talk about this topic, workplace violence and even law enforcement. Jake, what you were talking about before is when, the individual decides to leave their spouse or their abusive partner, law enforcement calls it the danger zone.
Yeah.
There's a lot of resources for these individuals, your pets, your kids, your safe houses, all of the things. But the one place where they're sure to be able to locate you is the workplace. Now, if your workplace knows about it, if they have a heads up about it, there's a lot of resources that they can implement to create a safer place for you and that entire employee population. They can switch you to a different location. They could ramp up security. Security knows if this vehicle enters the parking lot or this person enters the parking lot or on the ground, watch out for these things, because chances are, like you mentioned, Jake, stalking, it's one of those precursors to a violent incident. And chances are that person's not going to see it, but other people are going to see it. And so, creating that awareness for the workplace, it's really important to encourage people to speak up, but they have to feel safe in order to do that. They have to feel comfortable in order to do that.
Yeah, that's a great point. I think even within that, like organizations, making sure that their employees know that there is assistance there. They might have EAP programs, employee assistance programs, but if the employees know they're there, they're much more likely to at least be willing to come forward and say, yes, I'm having this problem, and yes, I need some help. There's definitely organizations that have these resources available, but it doesn't necessarily get communicated down to each employee, each team member to even be willing to report that stuff.
Yeah, and it's showing up in different ways now, and in ways I didn't even consider, or we didn't used to have it in our training. Nowadays with social media and, being able to FaceTime, I've heard at least probably half a dozen times over this past year of situations where employees at work, they would have to have their spouse or domestic partner on FaceTime almost the entire duration of their shift. So their partner could see, who are you talking to? How are you talking to them? How are you interacting? What really shocked me in some of these situations, on 2 occasions, the employees go, yeah, so if he or she is on the phone with their partner, we know not to be in the footage anywhere on camera. So we will avoid it, or we'll, slip them a note, or what. People are going to great lengths to help them hide this or cover it up. And
Instead of seeing it as a red flag, they're
Yeah.
assisting in the process. Yeah.
Yeah.
That's crazy.
And I'm like, oh, okay, we have some work to do here. And then by the end of the training, they get it. And especially in a leadership role, I mean, it's your job to make people feel safe in this environment, not go to lengths to cover it up. But some of these signs and symptoms of someone going through it, they can be almost textbook. Can you guys talk a little bit about, some things that you've heard of or some of your experiences in dealing with these situations?
Yeah, I mean, the fear that it creates is a huge one, and just how that can change behavior. There's actually been a few that I've been involved in as part of doing security for an organization years ago, where this kind of behavior starts happening, and people will go to it's all about power and control, right? On the
Right,
abuser
yeah.
side, it's all about power and control. And those individuals will go at great lengths to keep that power and control. And so the way in which, like, one of the examples that I found fascinating was the abuser copied the survivor's phone onto his. So every single thing she did, he would see. All
Oh,
text
wow.
messages, emails, literally everything, copied it over. It's like virtual stalking, right? It was absolutely fascinating. Well, when you feel under that microscope and it creates that kind of fear in you, it changes everything you do. So you might be withdrawn, you might not be inclined to go do social events, showing up to work, lost productivity, showing up to work late, early, staying late, leaving early. And there can be some physical signs as well, of course, if there's bruises or things like that. They might be trying to cover them up, clothes that are inappropriate for the season, different things. But it's usually, you'll notice some changes interpersonally in how the survivor is acting. And they're not themselves. They may not just, like, it's almost like the joy is sapped from them because they feel like they're being hunted all the time. And, if you watch how an animal looks when they know they're being hunted, they kind of look distressed. And you can, like, if you pay attention for those kinds of things, you'll notice those changes in behavior.
Yeah, and I think something that leaders can do is create those relationships with, their employees, because you're going to know when all of a sudden someone's calling in sick and it's like, this doesn't seem like good news. It doesn't seem like, or you're not sick. What's going on? I think those little indicators, will be a little bit more present if you create somewhat of a relationship with your employees and kind of understand, what's normal, what's not normal behavior for them.
Mm-hmm.
I think a good point to make too is that understanding that there is a pathway to violence, and some of the stuff that you might be seeing on a day-to-day basis, it might be completely inappropriate for relationships and all that stuff too, but it could at some point escalate to actually somebody getting murdered, somebody getting hurt significantly. So even though it might, the small stuff that you're seeing might seem a little bit harmless, debatable, but it could be part of that pathway that's going to lead to something bigger. So it's definitely important for people to see that and know to report it.
And one thing too, I just want to briefly talk about before we wrap this up is, we talk a lot about the victims in this situation and having resources and all that, but what about the abusers? What are some common traits of, those that are abusing their domestic partners?
Yeah, that's a great point too. And so often we see that it's not necessarily people that you would expect. Often it is, but it's not always. There's quite a few times where it might be that most charismatic person in the room, the person you actually want to go have a drink with, have a good time with, shoot the shit with, whatever that is. Like, they're a good time. They're good people to be around, but you don't necessarily know what's going on. So you definitely can't pigeonhole what you would expect or try to profile what that person would look like. 'Cause it really does fall across, kind of all means there.
Yeah. Usually people are surprised when they find out someone is on the other end of that abuse, because it's usually the person you want to go out and have a drink with after work, and they're really charismatic. But you talked about the power and control wheel. I mean, it's this like continuum of a cycle, right? Where it's like, the abuse happens and then I'm so sorry. And then there's a honeymoon phase, and then it just kind of continues and continues and continues. I mean, these individuals are usually pretty charismatic and somebody that you're pretty shocked.
They'll seem normal.
Yeah.
I've known a couple different people that have been abusers, and like know them personally, and they are normal. And it's those people when these kinds of relationships are happening, you might not notice if you don't have a personal relationship with these individuals. Like, if you're just observing as like entirely as a bystander, you might not notice the behavior of an abuser because they do have that normality. Where if you have some relationship there, you might be able to spot some of those nuances. Particularly if you see the relationship between the intimate, the people that are in the intimate relationship, you might start seeing some of those signs where it's like, that's interesting, because there's kind of that leakage. They can't perform all of the time. It does kind of leak out, and then behind closed doors, that's where it really comes out. But they try to have this persona. It's like a Jekyll and Hyde persona kind of thing on to the external, observing people. So that's why we talk about, in training, one thing you can absolutely observe is stalking. If you see stalking, one, that's elevated threatening behavior, but you might not know them from their personality to be an abuser, but you'll definitely recognize stalking. So you can look for that.
Yeah, excellent point. And I think that's a great way to leave it here. Excellent insight, team. I appreciate your thoughts on that topic. For all you leaders out there, I hope you gained some valuable insights into the nexus between domestic violence and workplace violence and the relationship between the two, and how this can absolutely be a workplace challenge situation, something that you might have to deal with. So get ahead of it. Build it into your policies, put it into your training, create that awareness so individuals feel comfortable speaking up, coming forward, and talking to your teams. So thank you so much for joining us today. I hope you reach out to our website if you're looking for more insight, and go ahead and feel free to contact us through any of those channels available. Thank you.